Hi, my name is Mandy Nevius, and I'm a member of Tulsa Chorale. Thank you for joining me today for the second episode of our series, Beethoven and the Beatles, Celebrating the Revolutionaries. Today, we'll dive right into the history of Beethoven's Mass in C, and then later we'll transition into a brief analysis of the Beatles' first two studio albums. We'll begin with Beethoven. In the middle of Beethoven's composing years, during the time he was losing his hearing, he wrote two religious works for solo voices, chorus, and orchestra. The first, Christus am Olberg, or Christ on the Mount of Olives, was his one and only oratorio. It was written in 1803 and then revised for publication 8 years later. The second, Mass in C, was written in 1807 and it was published in 1812. Before Christus, Beethoven had only written two vocal works featuring soloists and a chorus. The operatic Christus was written very hurriedly, in only 2 weeks, and it is widely regarded as one of Beethoven's lesser works, but critics praise his Mass in C for its soothing, joyful, and intimate expression. It was an experiment that was not well liked in Beethoven's time, but has since gained the approval of its audiences. Beethoven's Mass in C was commissioned by Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, who was the grandson of Haydn's most important employer. It was to be performed in the castle chapel at Eisenstadt on the name day of his wife. The prince actually hired prominent composers every year to write a new mass for this special occasion. Haydn was much more experienced in composing sacred music and had previously written 6 masses for the princess's name day. But he was old in age and by this point incapacitated. He died only 2 years later. So when the prince proposed this commission to Beethoven, he accepted, despite knowing that his mass would not compare to any of Haydn's 14 masses. Beethoven wrote the entire mass during the summer of 1807, beginning in Baden and completing it in Heiligenstadt. At the time, he was battling severe headaches. He wrote Nicholas about the headaches, saying that they, quote, prevented me at first from working at all, and even now have allowed me to do very little work, end quote. Beethoven also sent a letter from his doctor, serving as proof for his ailment. His doctor prescribed a few different treatments, including leeches and rubbing bark from spurge laurel on his arms, but all to no avail. His headaches still plagued him. But Beethoven managed to continue his work on the Mass, as well as his 5th and 6th symphonies. He wrote both indoors and outdoors, roaming the hills and fields. While writing his own Mass, it's evident that Beethoven studied Haydn's Masses, which Beethoven described as inimitable masterpieces in a letter that summer to Nicholas. Beethoven's sketches for the Gloria included 2 passages from Haydn's Creation Mass. However, Beethoven did not simply want to imitate. While drawing upon Haydn's work for inspiration, Beethoven pursued his own musical interpretation of the text. In the end, his Mass was quite unique from any other Mass, to a fault in the eyes of the prince. The court was expecting immense excitement, dramatized agony, jubilation, and an enthusiastic conclusion, but that's not the Mass Beethoven composed. The Mass premiered on September 13, 1807. It seemed apparent at the outset that the performance was doomed to fail. Firstly, Beethoven was not invited to stay in a private room at the palace, as was customary for him. Instead, he stayed in a musty apartment in town with the court secretary of music. And secondly, during rehearsals, the singers and musicians were unobliging. In fact, 4 of the 5 altos missed the dress rehearsal completely. Indeed, the performers were not prepared, and their indifference did not cast Beethoven's work in a brilliant light. Reportedly, after hearing the performance, the prince offended Beethoven with his criticism, likely complaining of the Mass's gentle, devotional, ceremonial sound and the overall subtlety and simplicity of the piece. Nicholas later wrote about the Mass in a letter saying, quote, Beethoven's Mass is unbearably ridiculous and detestable, and I am not convinced that it can ever be performed properly. I am angry and mortified, end quote. Beethoven, known for his untamed temper, left the conversation in a fury. It's been rumored that he left the palace immediately, but there is evidence that suggests he remained at Eisenstadt for another few days. Unfortunately, he never received another commission from the Esterhazy family again. Even after this humiliation, Beethoven defended his Mass. He was pleased with his own originality, and in a letter to Breitkopf and Hertel, the world's oldest music publishing house, he wrote of the Mass, quote, "I think that I have treated the text in a manner in which it has rarely been treated," end quote. Beethoven struggled for years to get his Mass in C published. He even offered it to Breitkopf and Härtel for free, and that he would pay to have it copied. It was not until 5 years after its first performance that Breitkopf and Härtel reluctantly published the Mass, and when it was published, perhaps as an insult to the ungracious Nicholas, Beethoven decided to dedicate the Mass in C to his dependable patron at the time, Prince Ferdinand Kinsky. Beethoven would only write one more Mass, Missa Solemnis, in 1823. Though it defied expectation and was not popular in its time, Beethoven's Mass in C is a treasure, and I hope to unpack in our next episode the creativity embedded in his Mass, and that even outside of his comfort zone, Beethoven lived up to his status as a revolutionary. Thank you for listening to this section of our video discussing the history of Beethoven's Mass in C. Before we continue to talk about the Beatles' first 2 albums, I wanted to quickly remind you of Tulsa Chorale's upcoming concert celebrating Beethoven's 250th birthday and the Beatles' 60th birthday. Our concert will take place on October 13th at the Admiral Twin Drive-In and will include a showing of Tulsa Chorale's virtual performance of the Kyrie and Gloria from Beethoven's Mass in C, a screening of the film Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and a live performance of Beatles songs by Tulsa's own Retro Rockets. Tickets will be $20 per car and will be available at the gate or in advance online. The gate will open at 6:45 and the concert will begin at 7:30. It's going to be a fantastic evening celebrating these revolutionaries. You won't want to miss it. Now, roll over Beethoven. It's time to talk about the Beatles' first 2 albums. In December 1962, the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, had limited success, reaching number 17 on the New Musical Express charts. John's harmonica opens the song, and then John and Paul's charming, unrefined harmony follow. The skiffle beat only hints at the rock and roll to come from the Beatles. Overall, it's rather tame. George Martin recalled, quote, "I was by now absolutely convinced that I had a hit group on my hands, though I knew that I hadn't got it with the first record, feeling the quality of the song wasn't really up to it," end quote. At an earlier session on September 4th, Martin expressed concerns about Ringo's drumming, which he felt didn't have enough drive. So for the 3-hour recording session on September 11th, Martin hired professional drummer Andy White to play the drums. Ringo watched while White played the drums and Ringo shook the tambourine. White also played drums on P.S. I Love You, which was recorded that same day, while Ringo played the maracas. Paul's sentimental vocal performance on P.S. I Love You would pave the way for future ballads. One notable moment in the song is how Paul climbs up from the P.S. I Love You with a you, which expresses the honesty of the lyric. His impromptu scat near the end, however, allows a brief moment of fun amid the seriousness. By the next recording session on November 26th, Martin's faith in Ringo's drumming abilities was much more certain. Martin entered the session convinced that their cover of How Do You Do It would top the charts, but John and Paul came to Martin with a sped-up version of their original song, Please Please Me. This song exuded so much raw energy, Martin knew it needed to be their next single. Again, John's harmonica starts the song. Then Paul and John enter with their enthusiastic duet, Paul on the initial high note with John moving beneath. Its clever lyrics, particularly the double please, are both polite and suggestive. The song closes with Ringo's bold bursts of percussion. The version that made the album features a fluffed line in the third verse, but despite its imperfection, it would be the Beatles' first #1 single. It was unusual at the time for a band to write their own music and lyrics, but the Beatles proved with their first 3 singles that they were more than capable. The popularity of the song Please Please Me demanded a full-length album. The entire Please Please Me album, which Martin originally wanted to call Off the Beatle Track, was recorded in 12 hours. The recording session came right after the Beatles' short tour through Britain. John was sick with a cold, and his voice was shot. His hoarse voice is especially noticeable in the last song they recorded that day, their cover of Twist and Shout. At the end of the long session, they were only one song shy of finishing the album. Someone suggested they record Twist and Shout, which the Beatles played at almost all of their shows. Everyone knew John's voice would only hold out for one take. He strained his way through the whole song, but it's his hoarse voice that makes the record wonderfully raw, imperfect, and explosive. The Beatles recorded 5 other cover songs that day: A Taste of Honey, Baby It's You, Boys, Chains, and Anna Go to Him. With their unique nasally accents, their harmonies, and their high energy, the Beatles managed to personalize these rock and roll songs. The album also featured the 3 previously mentioned singles, as well as 5 additional Lennon-McCartney songs: Misery, Ask Me Why, Do You Want to Know a Secret, There's a Place, and the song that kicks off the whole album, I Saw Her Standing There, which was an all-out rocker that Paul and John wrote one night on the way home from a gig. From Paul's spirited count-off at the beginning to the elated screams before the guitar solo, and all the way to the last chord, the song is utterly exciting. The album, Please Please Me, was released on March 22nd, 1963. It would be released the following year in the United States under the title Introducing the Beatles, but it lacked the songs Please Please Me and Ask Me Why. Though not an instant hit, it did reach number 1 in May 1963, where it remained for 30 weeks. Its success set an intimidating standard for the Beatles to live up to. Their next single would prove that they were indeed special. From Me to You shot to number 6 on the charts and sold 200,000 copies in the first week alone, and would eventually spend 6 weeks at number 1 alongside the album With the Beatles, which it didn't even appear on. Shortly after its release, the pressure was on to make another hit single. She Loves You made the Beatles an absolute sensation. Their yeah yeah yeahs and falsetto oohs, paired with heads shaking in unison, marked the beginning of Beatlemania. With Ringo's tumbling drums at the start, listeners are thrown into the song with such powerful force. The vocals bounce between unison and harmony, and the last harmonized vocal that outlasts the final guitar chord soars with the added 6th, George's idea. It would also not be included on the forthcoming album, With the Beatles, but it's magical on its own. With the Beatles was released on November 22, 1963, only 8 months to the day after Please Please Me was released. The demand for the album was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It sold 530,000 copies in the first day. It showcased 6 cover songs: Till There Was You, Please Mr. Postman, Roll Over Beethoven, You Really Got a Hold on Me, Devil in Her Heart, and Money, That's What I Want. George's first original, Don't Bother Me, made its way onto the album, although it is a rather weak songwriting debut and his guitar solo is not his best. But the 7 Lennon-McCartney songs are mostly strong. Unlike Hookups on the Dance Floor from the last album, It Won't Be Long presents more than a simple romance. Its hook is clever wordplay. It won't be long till I belong to you. It's the most thrilling upbeat song on the album, and it's full of opposing emotions that move between self-pity and happiness. The Beatles originally tried recording Hold Me Tight for their previous album, but they scrapped it only to resurrect it for this album. Paul delivers a straight, polished performance, and the song is generally considered a solid example of early 60s Beatles rocker. All My Loving was written completely by Paul, and it was essentially his first breakout song. It was the first song the Beatles performed on their debut appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. I Want to Be Your Man was originally written by John for Ringo, but then it was offered to the Rolling Stones. While John and Paul were sharing a taxi in London with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the latter two mentioned they were looking for songs. John and Paul mentioned I Want to Be Your Man and suggested they record it as a single. It was unfinished at the time, but later when they met up with the Stones at a club they were playing at, John and Paul completed the song in a corner of the room right in front of them. The Stones version was also recorded and released in 1963. It was written to be simple, so Ringo could sing it while playing the drums. And interestingly, it was the oldest song the Beatles played at their final concert in 1966. The other Lennon-McCartney songs on the album include All I've Got to Do, Little Child, and Not a Second Time. With the Beatles remained at the #1 spot on the charts for 21 weeks. Combined with Please Please Me, they stayed at the top of the charts for 51 consecutive weeks. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next time we'll discuss the Beatles' third and fourth studio albums. We'll also take a close look at Beethoven's Mass in C. I hope you'll join me. Bye for now.